Ram Kaluahin enjoyed feeling the wind through his thick black hair as he drove his small American convertible down the two-lane highway that would take him and his wife to the southernmost part of his home island, Kaatani. Located in the southern Pacific Ocean, Kaatani actually consisted of several islands, the largest of which was about 65 kilometers from end to end, and was home to about 1.5 million natives and another 100,000 foreigners, mostly Americans. Kaatani was an independent nation with its own government, police, and defense forces. Historically, the nation had been ruled by a monarch, but had adopted a democratic system similar to that used in the United States. It had a president, elected for a 5-year term, and a House of Representatives, whose members were elected every 2 years by the citizens. The nation had begun an aggressive modernization campaign more than 70 years ago under a previous monarch who felt the time had come to bring the population into the 20th century. As a result, Kaatani now had all the comforts of modern life, including the internet, along with all the trappings of a modern civilization. Fortunately, the people had managed to remain true to most of their ancestral values, and as a result, the nation still had the lowest divorce rate in the world, surpassing even India, which, according to some reports, has only a 1% divorce rate. Except for the strange rocks scattered on the slopes of Mount Satani that glowed at night, the sandy beaches and the hospitality of the population, Kaatani had almost nothing to offer potential conquerors, and had so far escaped the stigma of foreign domination. Even the Japanese did not consider Kaatani during World War II, deeming it too far south to be of much use in their conquest of the Pacific. This was where Ram had been born and raised, the place he called home, and he loved it. It was a good day for driving, he thought. Not too hot, not too cold, and the humidity was bearable at this altitude. However, the reason for the trip both angered and saddened him. He looked at the woman sitting in the passenger seat. Her name was Marion. She was a California beauty, he thought. Blonde hair, soft, supple skin, firm breasts with prominent nipples that begged to be sucked and tanned, toned legs made for sex. She wasn't just his woman, she was any man's wet dream. He had just over an hour before he reached his destination, so he thought about their life together. He met her 6 years ago when he first accepted a teaching position at the local campus of a U.S. university based in Washington, D.C. At the time, he had just finished his doctorate and had decided to return home. The local university management welcomed him with open arms and offered him the position. He took to it like a fish to water. He loved teaching and enjoyed teaching the local youth. She worked in the admissions office as a counselor, and the two met at a social event organized by the president of the university. They hit it off, dated for a year, and ended up getting married. She was an only child, and a couple of years earlier had lost her parents in a car accident. As far as he knew, she had no other relatives. Strangely, she wanted a traditional Kaatani marriage. He thought this was strange, since most local girls wanted anything but a traditional marriage. At first, he thought maybe she was patronizing him or was a bit delusional, and questioned her about it. Maybe she didn't understand the true meaning of what she claimed to want, he thought, but she insisted that was what she wanted. So he gave her a text file with the chant she would have to repeat at the ceremony and taught her the correct way to pronounce the words. She already knew some of the local language, enough to communicate in the local markets, but not enough to fully understand the true meaning of what she was committing herself to. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Towards the end, Marion knelt down in her short white robe and picked up the pillow beside her. She lifted it toward him and intoned the traditional phrase perfectly. A rough translation of the phrase was, "I submit to you, my husband, in body, mind, and spirit." Of course, the phrase had a much fuller meaning, but it had long since been forgotten by all but the oldest and most traditional of the population. He grabbed the sivaj lying on the pillow, a short, curved dagger carried by husbands in the old days, a sign that they were off limits and prepared to defend to the death what was theirs and theirs alone. He admired Marion's handiwork, the hilt richly adorned with his family's seal. He had even anointed it with his own blood, as was done in the old days. After repeating the chant, she wielded the knife and cut the ties that held the robe, letting it fall to the ground. She remained motionless, her body naked for all to see. He opened the tunic and presented his manhood to her. As tradition demanded, she took him into her mouth and sucked him until he was fully erect. To his amazement, she managed to engulf the entire penis in her mouth. At 20.5 centimeters, it was slightly larger than the average Kaatani man. Then he lifted her up and placed her naked on the altar. He spread her legs for all to see. He smiled as he gazed at her shaved pussy. In the old days, the husband used the sivaj to remove his bride's pubic hair at the altar, But that was not necessary today. She approached and, in front of all present, consummated the marriage at the altar until they both reached orgasm. In times past, it was here that the bride demonstrated to her family and the community as a whole that she was a virgin, worthy of her new husband. He helped her down the aisle and they both walked down the aisle to his car, his semen running down her leg, a sign that she now belonged to him and him alone. After their first night on the island, they flew back to the United States, where they enjoyed a week-long honeymoon in Las Vegas. The next 3 years were great. Ram and Marion continued their work at the university and spent their free time making sweet love to each other. He couldn't imagine a better life. Then, Marion was transferred to the main campus in Washington, D.C., so he also applied for the transfer, hoping that the university would give him the opportunity to teach in the U.S. Capitol. The board agreed to transfer him, and they both went to live and work in Washington. Marion had lived there before coming to Kaatani and promised to show him all the sights, not knowing that he had spent several weekends in the city while in college. Over the next year and a half, there were several changes in their lives. Marion's new position required her to sometimes work later than usual, to travel, and to attend social functions where she rubbed shoulders with the rich and famous. Sometimes, she took him with her to these functions. Although she introduced him as her husband and teacher, he had the feeling that he was a token object, or, worse, an exhibit, a zoo creature that the locals stared at. More than once he felt uncomfortable and irritated by the condescension with which others spoke to him. Some even raised their voices and spoke slowly, as if he were an invalid who did not understand English. More than once he had to refrain from putting his fist through someone's face. He recalled a conversation he had with Marion after a recent event. "Are you okay, honey?" he asked her as he stripped off his expensive suit. "No, I'm not," he growled in his deep baritone voice. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Did someone say something bad to you?" "It's the way it was said," he told her. "Remember that scene in The Outlaw Jose Wales where the character played by Chief Dan George was talking about meeting Abraham Lincoln at the White House?" She nodded. "Yes, I do," she said. They had just watched the movie on DVD a couple of nights before. "I can relate to what you said," he told her. "It's almost as if these people think that because I'm from the Pacific Islands, I should have a bone in my nose and wear a loincloth. Well, you'd need a pretty long one," she told him, patting his crotch. He let out a chuckle. "Don't they realize that I graduated at the top of my class at Harvard?" he asked her. "Don't they know how I worked to pay my way through college and not be a burden or have to carry a heavy debt?" "I don't think so," he said quietly. "Well, I don't like these people you have to kowtow to," he said. "And I sure as hell don't like being exhibited like some kind of zoo specimen. It's all part of the game," he said. "But I understand how you feel. You don't have to attend these things if you're uncomfortable, you know." He shook his head. "No, you're my wife and I should be there to support you," she said. "Besides, I don't like the idea of someone else accompanying you. By the way, what's up with that new boss of yours, Jake Hamilton?" he asked. She met Jake for the first time that night and instantly disliked him. He had "Pussy Hound" written all over his face. "He was brought in recently," he said. "He's from New York. He's really a sweet guy once you get to know him." "He seems to have taken a liking to you," Ram said. He couldn't help but notice that Jake had spent most of the night close to Marion. Sometimes he thought, maybe too close. "You're not jealous, are you?" she asked. He smiled and hugged her. "Of course he does," she said playfully. "But he knows you're married, right?" "Yes, he does," she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Good," Ram said. "I hope she remembers." They ended the night making love, but he had a bad feeling. Something told him he had to keep an eye on Jake Hamilton. Things went downhill for the next 6 months. Marion ended up being sent out of town with Jake several times, and she started working much later in the evenings, much more than before. As a result, her sex life virtually disappeared, as she always seemed to be too tired to do anything. It all fell apart one day when Ran was in his office reviewing student work. He was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and a petite brunette poked her head in. She pushed her glasses up on her nose before speaking. "Dr. Kaluahin, do you have a couple of minutes?" she asked. He looked at her and instantly recognized her as one of the girls who worked in Marion's office, but he couldn't remember her name. He motioned for her to come in. "Please come in," he said, "and feel free to call me Ram. My students call me Dr. Kaluahin, but you're obviously not one of my students." He walked into his office and planted himself in front of his desk. "What can I do for you, Miss Harper?" he said quietly. "April Harper. I work in your wife's office." "Yes, of course," he said. What can I do for you, Mrs. Harper? Well, she began nervously, I don't quite know how to say this. I think it's best to speak your mind, he told her. She nodded her head. Well, it's about your wife and Mr. Hamilton, he said, getting her full attention. I'm a little embarrassed to say it, since it's pretty personal, but I think what they're doing is wrong, and I thought you had a right to know. That is, unless you already know and approve of it. I know some people like that kind of thing. What kind of thing is that, Miss Harper? He asked. What are they doing that bothers you so much? They're, well, having an affair, she said. He felt his face turn red. Are you absolutely sure about that, Miss Harper? He asked. It's quite an accusation. Almost every day they go out to lunch, he says. And their lunches usually last longer than usual. They take trips together all the time. He buys her flowers, and it's pretty obvious from the way they interact that it's more than just a professional relationship. Plus, all the girls talk. Mr. Hamilton has quite a reputation, although he tries to keep it all under wraps. I see, said Ram. Have you personally witnessed anything to suggest they're having an affair? Have you seen them kissing or doing anything inappropriate? PDAs? Anything? I saw them kissing one day as they were leaving his office, she said nervously. He nodded when she finished. Tell me, Miss Harper, how often does Mr. Hamilton make them work off the clock? He asked. She shook her head. We generally don't work off the clock, he says. The university is very strict about it. Marion and Jake sometimes stay late, but the others usually don't. The only time we work off the clock is when we're preparing for graduation or enrolling students. But even then, we have time off to make up for it. They hate paying overtime. I see. Have you said anything to anyone else? He asked. I haven't said anything to anyone, he said. I wanted to tell you first. We all like Marion and don't want her to get in trouble. Still, it's disturbing. If the dean or the president saw it, there would be hell to pay. Yes, there would be, said Ram. Thank you for bringing it to my attention, Miss Harper. I'll take care of it from here. Thank you, Dr. Ram, she said. As she left the office, he pulled up a Word document he had saved on his computer. It was a list of private investigators and divorce attorneys he had been collating for a while. He hoped he wouldn't have to use that information, but he felt as if he had no choice. If she cheated on him, as April claimed, he would have no choice but to divorce her. He picked up the phone and made a call. He wasn't surprised when Marion texted him later that day to tell him she would be working late. He sat at the dining room table and pecked at the food, wondering what his wife and Jake were doing at that moment. Finally, he tossed the leftover lasagna into the garbage disposal and went upstairs to the master bedroom. He changed into pajamas and lay down on the bed with the TV on. He woke up when he heard Marion in the room. She walked over to him and kissed him on the forehead. Her hair smelled of freshly washed shampoo, and he thought he detected a whiff of aftershave. I'm so sorry, he said. I didn't know it would keep me this long. I ate something on the way home. He went into the bathroom and came out shortly after in flannel pajamas. That was his cue that there would be no sex tonight. He didn't want to sleep with her anyway, not if she'd just been with Jake. He's been working late a lot lately, Ram said. How much longer is he going to keep this up? It's hard to say, he said. He's had the whole department working late. He felt anger at hearing her lie to him, but he restrained himself. The whole department, huh? He asked. I thought the university frowned on overtime. Normally, yes, he said. But he's going to have a big meeting soon with some major donors, and we have to be prepared. That reminds me of something. We're leaving for New York on Friday. We'll leave before lunch and spend the weekend away. It's very little time, he said. Today was Wednesday, or rather, early Thursday morning. That's why we're working so hard right now, he said. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you, okay? He said, rolling onto his side. He knew this was bullshit, but he wanted to give her enough rope to hang herself. Later that day, Jake went to visit Ram in his office. He knocked on the door and entered before Ram could answer. Ram looked up and saw Jake's perpetual smile. What can I do for you, Mr. Hamilton? He asked. I just wanted to stop by and apologize for monopolizing your wife's time, he said. I'm sure you must have heard the rumors, and I just wanted to assure you that nothing inappropriate is going on. I'm not a big believer in rumors, Mr. Hamilton, Ram said. I deal in facts and evidence, and I certainly hope for your sake that nothing inappropriate is going on. Jake's smile faltered for a moment. It wasn't the response he'd expected. In his experience, academics tended to be weak, but there was something about the man that made Jake uneasy. Maybe it was his voice, or the inscrutable way Ram looked at him. Nothing about Ram said wimp. And for a moment, Jake considered abandoning his plans for Marion. Of course not, Dr. Kaluuheen, he said. By the way, Has Marion told you that we'll be in New York this weekend? He did, Ram said. He purposely didn't give Jake permission to refer to him by name, as he really disliked the man. I have to say, she gave me very short notice. I had planned to go out with her Friday night. She's been spending more time with you than with me lately. Again, I apologize for that, Jake said. It's our job. It never ends, you know. When do you think I'll be able to spend some time with my wife? Asked Rand with some sarcasm. Pretty soon, Jake said. We just need to take care of a few things. Look, I've got to go now. It's been nice talking to you. Ram said nothing as he watched Jake leave the office. When Jake left, he picked up the phone and made another call. That afternoon, he received a message from his wife, telling him that he had to go back to work late to prepare for the weekend meeting. He wasn't surprised, and the email he received on his personal account didn't surprise him either. He left for home, stopping for dinner along the way. He had had enough of lies and leftovers. Around 8 o'clock that evening, she called Marion at her office number, but the call went to voicemail. She left a message and called Jake's office number. He got the same answer, but left no message. He read and reread the message he had received earlier that day and looked at the attached photos. He was still at the computer when Marion returned in the evening. Are you still awake? He asked with a worried look on his face. Have you eaten anything? I stopped for dinner on the way home, he said. I'm tired of leftovers. I'm sorry, he said. We were just going over everything one last time for the meeting. So you were in your office? He asked. Well, yes, he said. Where else would it be? You tell me, he said. I called your office at 8 o'clock but got no answer. I also called Jake's office. We were in the conference room and we didn't hear the phone ring, she said. He knew the layout of her office and knew that was a lie. Even if that were the case, she should have seen the message light indicating someone had called. Didn't you see that I had left a message? He asked. I didn't even look, Ram. I'm sorry, she said. By the way, Jake said you were a little rude to him earlier today. And what's this about a date on Friday night? You never mentioned anything about that to me. It was supposed to be a surprise, he said. I guess it doesn't matter anymore. Of course it matters, Ram, he said. No, it's not like that, he said. I have to go to bed now, Marion. Good night. He climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, wondering how much longer the deception would last before he put an end to it. He said nothing as she slipped under the covers and tried to curl up next to him. I love you, Ram, she whispered in his ear. He growled in response. I love you too, he said quietly, a hint of sadness in his voice. Good night. She took the hint and turned away from him. He could hear her sobs from the side of the bed, but he pushed them from his mind. The next morning, he cornered her before leaving. Can you at least tell me where you are staying and keep in touch with me over the weekend? He asked. Of course. He wrote down the name of the hotel and the room number and handed it to her. Thank you, he said, folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. Have a good trip. He turned to walk out the door, but Marion intercepted him. Ram, what's wrong with you? He asked. You haven't been yourself lately. Have I done something to make you angry with me? He almost laughed out loud. I think you know the answer, she told him. Her face paled as he walked out the door, without kissing her goodbye. I love you, Ram, she said, as he climbed into his car. So you said, he replied, before starting the car and heading to work. Although the damage had already been done, he hoped she would realize her mistake and change her mind about going to New York. He already knew from the investigator's report that the meeting was a sham concocted by Jake to get the two of them alone for a weekend. But unfortunately, she and Jake left for the airport at lunchtime, and he didn't hear from her until later when he arrived at the hotel. He didn't hear from her for the rest of the weekend, but he did hear from the investigator, who kept him up to date on what the two lovers were up to. According to reports he read, they had a great time, visited local nightclubs, danced and drank, and then had sex for most of the weekend. She almost put her fist through a wall when she saw a video of the two of them in bed. She couldn't help but notice that Jake wasn't using any kind of protection. She didn't know if Marion was still on birth control. He considered his options. In her mind, divorce was a no-brainer, but he also knew, from conversations with colleagues, that in the United States divorce almost always went badly for husbands. Then an idea occurred to her, and that Sunday she made a couple of calls overseas. She was already in bed when Marion came home Sunday night. Normally, he greeted her with a hug, a kiss, and a roll in bed. But not this time. He didn't even offer to help her carry her bags upstairs. She put the suitcases away in the closet, changed in the bathroom, and got into bed. She tried to kiss him, but he turned away to avoid touching her. The next morning, he got up before her and left the house without saying a word to her. During his break, he contacted his investigator and obtained the full report of Marion's activities over the weekend, then made another call. Marion tried to contact him throughout the day, but he ignored her calls and messages. That night, he saw her at home, but spoke to her very little. Finally, she cornered him in the living room after dinner. "Ram, what is it?" he asked. "You haven't said 2 words to me since I got home. Don't you want to know if we've been successful?" He stared at her before speaking. "I'm sure you got what you wanted," he said. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. He picked up the laptop and showed a video of her in bed with Jake. Her eyes widened as he played the video. "My God, Jake, how good you feel inside me," moans the Marion in the video as Jake pumps his seed inside her. "Better than that savage you married?" Jake asked. "Please, you know I don't like you talking about him like that," she said. "He may be a savage, but he's a good man." "Well, why are you here with me instead of him?" he asked her. "You know why, Jake," she said. "I do," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "Come on, let's do it again." Disgusted, Ram turned off the video and glared at Marion. "How did you get it?" he asked Ram when he stopped the video. "What difference does it make?" he replied. "What I'd like to know is why. Ram, it was just sex, that's all," he said. "It had nothing to do with you. You know I would never hurt you." "Well, you did," he said. "So tell me, dear wife, I noticed you didn't bother to use protection. Were you planning on getting pregnant by him and trying to pass it off as mine?" "I had never thought about it," he said. "Weren't you worried about diseases you might catch from him?" asked Ram. "According to my report, Jake has at least 2 other women he sees regularly. And that's not counting his frequent one-night stands." "He assured me he's clean," Marion said. "And of course, you foolishly believed him," Ram said. "After the way you disrespected me, I can't continue to work here. I've asked for a transfer home. I've already spoken to the chancellor, and he agrees it's for the best. He also agrees to fire you and Jake for flagrantly violating university rules." "When do you plan to leave?" he asked. "At the end of the quarter, which ends this week," he said. "We leave on Friday. What about us?" he asked. "There is no we anymore," he told her. "You killed that. The divorce will be over when we get back. You and Jake will have to be there. What you do after that, I don't care." "Why does Jake have to be there?" he asked. "Why do you think?" she asked in reply. "It's him you were cheating on me with. The order has already been given. He can leave peacefully, on his own, or he can be extradited." "Extradited?" he asked. "Isn't that a little extreme?" "You forget that the Kaatani nation has an extradition treaty with the U.S., he said. "When you married me, you got dual citizenship. As for Jake, he has no choice. He'll be there, one way or another." Ram stood up, indicating that he was finished and would say no more. Marion sat there, stunned at what had just happened. Jake had assured her that Ram would never find out, but he had. "Please, Ram, I don't want a divorce," she said tearfully. He looked at her for a few seconds before leaving the room. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "Wasn't it good enough for you?" "You're the best," he said. "Then explain to me why," he demanded. "Well, Jake and I met in college," she said. "He was my first, and I guess I fell in love with him all over again." "I guess the old saying is right," he told her. "What saying is that?" she asked in confusion. "It's a version of the biblical passage that says there is a time for everything," he said. "A time to cheat and a time to die." "What do you mean?" she asked. "Are you saying there's no hope for us?" "When you cheated on me, you killed our marriage," he said. "You killed us. I hope it was worth it." The rest of the week was difficult. The provost called Jake and Marion into his office and dismissed them both for violating university rules on fraternization. He then handed Jake a sheet of paper that had been emailed to him the day before. "What the hell is this?" asked Jake angrily. "A summons from the kingdom of Kaatani," the chancellor said. "You are part of Dr. Kaluaheen's divorce. I have been told that if you refuse to go, you will face extradition. A plane ticket is being sent by express mail. Security will meet you there." "This is bullshit," Jake exclaimed. "Maybe," the chancellor said. "But the State Department has told me that everything is legal. They're staying out of it. Now pack up your trash and get out of my school. Both of you." Dejected and embarrassed, Marion went to her desk and gathered her things. Jake, however, had another idea and headed for Ram's office. Ram was grading papers when Jake burst into his office, angry. Ram put down his pen before looking at Jake. "You son of a bitch!" shouted Jake as he crossed the office, determined to take the bigger man down. Ram simply reached out a hand and caught Jake in the throat, abruptly ending his reckless charge. He stood over Jake, who was on the floor panting, and shook his head. Get out of my office, he said calmly. And I don't want to see you until the hearing. The rest of the week passed rather quickly. Ram avoided Marion as much as possible and said virtually nothing to her. Marion tried to win back her husband's sympathy, but he ignored her and just walked away when she started to cry. On Wednesday, the movers arrived at the house, packed their things, and prepared them for shipment to Kaatani. A realtor had already put a for sale sign in the yard. With everything out of the house and all his affairs in order, Ram and Marion spent a night in a motel, sleeping in different beds. It was hard, as he always found her sexy and very tempting, but he was determined not to give in to her. They flew out early Friday morning. After settling into his Marriott hotel room, he made a couple of calls and learned that Jake had left the United States and was on his way to the island. He then learned that the procedure would take place on Monday and that Jake had been detained by the King's Guard, an elite unit of the National Police. The weekend was hard for both of them. Marion tried her best to convince him not to go through with it, but he rebuffed her efforts. "Please, can't we get through this?" she begged him. He looked at her and merely shook his head. "No," he growled. "You disrespected me in the worst way a woman can. You made your choice. Now you must live with it." "But I promise it won't happen again," she whimpered. "Please, Ram. I love you, and I loved you too," he said. "What good are your promises? Remember the promise you made me when we got married? You didn't keep it. So how can I trust you to keep any other promises? We can try therapy, can't we?" he asked. "Please, Ram, I beg you. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't mean to hurt you." "Silence, woman," he thundered. "It meant everything to me, damn it. You committed yourself to me and only me, just as I committed myself only to you. I kept my commitment to you, but you broke yours to me. Now it's time to own it and move on." Monday morning finally arrived, and Ram woke Marion up at 4:30. "Why are you waking me up so early?" he asked. "It's time to get ready," he said. "You should get some breakfast before we go. We've got a long trip ahead of us." "But the courthouse isn't that far away," he said. "It's a few blocks away. We can walk there in less than half an hour." "We're not going to court," he said. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Mount Satani," he said, referring to the dormant volcano located on the southern tip of the island. The last time it erupted, more than 2,500 years ago, it blew off the top third of the mountain, leaving a giant hole in the ground that later became a sacred place for the island's population. "You were the one who wanted a traditional marriage. I think it's only fair that we have a traditional divorce." I realized what I had said. "What?" she asked. "You don't mean—" "Yes," he said. "Now get ready. We have plenty of time to eat before we hit the road." Marion stood up, startled, and went into the bathroom to get ready. She knew the legends of Mount Satani and its place in local folklore. It was the traditional place where marriages were dissolved. But those ceremonies usually ended with someone's death. Surely he wouldn't do that, he thought. After dressing, Ram put a sports bag in the trunk of the car they had rented and drove her to the dining room, where they had breakfast. He ate a hearty breakfast, as he always did, but she barely touched the food. Inside, she was a nervous wreck. Surely the old stories were just that. Stories, she told herself. Or were they? The drive to the mountain, located on the southern tip of the island, would take more than an hour. Sitting in the passenger seat, she stared out the window while feeling like a criminal condemned to the gallows. At last they arrived at their destination. Ram exited the winding two-lane highway and drove to the parking lot, where he stopped the car. He got out, grabbed his bag, and opened Marion's door. "Let's go," he said quietly. Marion looked up at him with tears in her eyes and slowly stepped out of the car. Her legs buckled as she stood up, but he held her and guided her to the ancient rock steps that led to the top of Mount Satani. "Climb the steps," he told her. Trembling, she began the long climb up the steps, wondering how many other people would have done it in ancient times. When they reached the top, 2 uniformed members of the King's Guard came out to meet them. As they looked, they saw several older Kahatanis sitting in a semicircle in front of the ancient rock plank that protruded over a giant, gaping hole that had once been the caldera of Mount Satani. He knew that the hole was at least 1,500 meters deep and that a lava stream flowed through the bottom. They also observed a portable gazebo surrounded by the King's Guard. On both sides of the arbor waved large flags. Inside the enclosure was an older Kaatani, dressed in traditional costume. Marion let out a gasp when she realized who it was. She looked at Ram. "Do you know the king?" he asked. "I should," he said. "He's my father's brother." Ram looked at the guards. "Prepare her," he told them. She watched as they led her to one tent and went to another, where she donned her traditional robe. She considered her sivage and remembered that day on the beach when Marion had given it to her. He hoped he would never have to wear it. He put it on his belt and went back outside. By this time, Marion was ready and being led to the plank, dressed in a short red robe. Jake had already been handed over and was standing on the plank, arms and legs firmly secured. He wasn't very happy, but the guards had already informed him to keep quiet unless he was being addressed. Ram took a step before the pavilion and bowed to his uncle, who acknowledged him with a nod. He then took his place in front of the court, which was seated in a semicircle before the board. "Prince Ram Kaluahin," said the man in the center of the semicircle. "This court has reviewed your petition for divorce. We have also reviewed all the evidence and have determined that your case is valid. Based on the evidence, your petition for divorce has been granted. Do you wish to address those who have wronged you before executing final judgment?" "Yes, counselor," Ram said. "Very well then," the older man said. "Proceed." Ram bowed to the court and turned to Marion and Jake, who were now tied together on the board. He could tell that Marion was frightened, as she had every right to be. Jake, for his part, had no idea what was about to happen, and was still as arrogant as ever. "What the hell is this all about?" asked Jake as Ram walked toward them. "Shut up," Marion said to Jake. "Why?" Jake asked. "Are they going to sacrifice us to their volcano god or something?" "God, you're an asshole," he whispered. "Are you about to finish?" asked Ram. They said nothing as they looked back at him. Ram continued to stare at his soon-to-be ex-wife. "Do you remember the promise you made me on the beach 5 years ago?" he asked. "I remember," he said. "Did you understand well the nature of the oath we swore to each other?" he asked. I do," he said slowly. Ram nodded his head, sad. He had given her an out, but she had not accepted it. It would have been one thing if she didn't understand the nature of their marriage commitment. However, her admission to the contrary sealed their fate. "Promise?" Jake asked. "What promise?" Marion wanted a traditional Kaatani marriage, part of which requires the couple to pledge their mind, body and soul to each other for as long as they live, he explained. "You see, Jake, here we believe that the most important traits a person can have are loyalty and fidelity. Without them, nothing else matters. In the old days, when a Kaatani couple married, they would promise those things to each other, in front of witnesses, with full knowledge that the cost of betrayal would be their own lives." He pulled the sharp, curved knife from his belt. Jake's eyes widened at the sight of the blade. "But that's murder," Jake stammered. "In your culture, maybe," Ram said. "Here, we call it divorce. This leaf was given to me by Marion on the day we were married, as tradition dictates. It's more than just an ornament or a trinket to hide behind glass. In my ancestors' time, it was worn by the husband as a sign that he was unavailable. It also served as a warning to anyone who might intrude on the couple. Someone like you, Jake." Ram pulled his arm out in a flash. When he was done, a red line appeared on Jake's neck, and his eyes widened as he realized that his carotid artery had just been severed. Blood gushed and spilled down his neck, and he began to stagger as he lost strength. Marion tried to steady them on the rock plank, but found it difficult as Jake lost the strength to stand. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind came crashing down on them, sending Marion and Jake tumbling into the abyss. Ram closed his eyes for a moment to keep from sobbing. He opened his eyes and threw the blade into the large hole, then took off his wedding ring and threw it behind the knife. He heard a hammer behind him, and the head of the court took the floor. "This divorce is final," he said. Ram stared straight ahead as the court gathered his things and left. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see his uncle standing beside him. "You loved her," her uncle said. "I did," Ram said. "You even gave her a way out, but she wouldn't take it," the older man said. "In the end, she did the honorable thing." "I guess so," Ram said. "I know this has been the hardest thing you've ever had to do, my son," the king said. "Believe me, when you get to my position, it doesn't get any easier." "You'll outlive me, man," Ram said. The old man let out a chuckle. "Hardly," he said. "In any case, your honor has been restored. Now is the time to mourn what has been lost and move on. By the way, Sika is anxiously awaiting your call. She still loves you and has managed to keep the hounds at bay." "After all these years?" asked Ram. "Yes," said the king. He pulled out a letter and handed it to Ram. "I would make a good wife for you and a good queen when the time comes, and I must admit, I've always liked having a real doctor in the family." The last time Ram had spoken to her, she was in the United States studying medicine and doing her residency. "Now please call the girl and give her your number, and let her know I'm not your answering service," the king said with a smile. Ram burst out laughing. "Thanks, man," he said. "I will." The old man smiled and patted him on the shoulder before walking away. Ran went to his tent and took off the tunic he was wearing. He sat for a moment and thought about Marion. He wiped away his tears and walked downstairs to his car. When he got into the car, he pulled out his phone and saw that he had reception. Dialed the number his uncle had given him. "Cha," said a sweet female voice on the first ring, thinking back to his younger years and remembering the sweet, curvaceous brunette woman he was so attracted to before he met Marion. "Cha," he said in response. "The divorce is final." "Good," she said. "Now please come home to the one who loved you first, Ram. I have missed you so much. I'm on my way," he said. Maybe there's something special about first love, he thought.